Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. Let's continue to this now. Analysts say a decision by the US to sanction 2 alleged ISIS financiers operating in South Africa does not bode well for the local economy. Another individual has been identified in Zambia. Now, the US says the 3 are key financiers and enablers of ISIS across Central, Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, this comes as South Africa aims to fulfill the outstanding requirements of the Financial Action Task Force, which greylisted South Africa last year. Let's now bring in Professor Daniel Meyer from the School of Public Management at the University of Johannesburg to weigh in on this particular story. Thank you so much for your time, Prof. Let's firstly get your reaction, to these sanctions that were imposed by the US on at least 3 ISIS affiliates, as we are now hearing, believed to be operating in South Africa and surrounding countries, and how long an investigation of this nature would have been.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yeah, it's not good news to hear that ISIS is very active in Africa, also in Southern Africa and South Africa. So it's not good news. ISIS is maybe the #1 feared terrorism organization in the world. In the US, it's a very high on their list, and that's why they've identified people. And it is not good news for us, because if ISIS operates in a country, it means that it's easy for them to access the country, movement in and out of the country, as well as access to funding within the country. So these 2 people that were identified by the US, they are busy transferring funds in and out South Africa for ISIS, as well as they are moving people and training people and moving them in and out of South Africa into other African countries. So it's really bad news to hear that they are very active in our country also.
And I mean, just on that note, just talking about the impact of terrorist organizations operating in this country, especially when we've said in, our introduction, when you consider that this may also affect the country's measures to exit the greylisting.
Yes, it's not good news in terms of our economy, in terms of our junk status, that the ratings agencies also rated us into junk status, but also the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, placed us into the grey listing group, because they found that of the 40 requirements, 20 of them in South Africa, it was transgressed in terms of money laundering, terrorism funding, financing of weapons of mass destruction. So those are not really a good thing for South Africa. The implications, it's huge for our economy in terms of our reputation that is damaged. The level of combating of terrorism in South Africa seems to be low. So there's an issue with that. And there's also this issue of cross-border transactions that's happening with these terrorism organizations. So if you look at what the US wants to do, we have got AGOA, the trade agreement with the US, which is very important for our exports. The US is red flagging this, and not good news, taking into account the election end of the year in the US, where it looks like Trump is going to win the election, and he's really anti-terrorism, anti-ISIS, so it doesn't look so good for South Africa at this point of time.
And I mean, just with the suggestions that South Africa is becoming, the biggest operating point for internal organizations of crime syndicates, how organized then should our own law enforcement authorities be, especially when dealing with global agents such as the US, especially also when you consider, as you say, the implications that this then brings to South Africa?
Yes, just to come back to the grey listing also, I know the National Treasury has allocated huge numbers of funding to fight the grey listing. So it's not that the government is not doing anything. They're really working hard to get us out of the grey listing. The grey listing means less investment, less economic growth. So everybody has identified this issue, and they hope to get us out of it by 2025. But this new sanction by the US has put us on the back foot again. And as you know, all of our law and order institutions has been negatively affected through the state capture decade, and they are still recovering. So I think that is why terror organizations like ISIS have seen the gap, and they are using our country with its massive economic infrastructure and a lot of funding that's available. And also another big issue is that our banking system, our financial system, used to be like number 1 or 2 rated in the world by the World Economic Forum in terms of global competitiveness, but we've really moved backwards in terms of that. So our banks and the Reserve Bank and everybody will have to work together to put us back where we were about 3 years back in terms of financial management and control.
And I mean, what we're hearing about, what the U.S. agencies have done is that the sanctions mean that now the funding and the properties of these, SA-linked individuals will be frozen and confiscated, and U.S. citizens are then barred from doing business with them. In the action of, these operatives in this country, what are the likely transactions that they are currently, just conducting in the country?
Yeah, I don't think it's 100% clear what exactly they are doing. I have just investigated a little bit about the 2 people that were mentioned there, but they are receiving funds, ISIS funding from abroad, from elsewhere in Africa, and transferring it back and collecting more money. It's the DRC is linked to this process, and also the movement of ISIS people, the training of ISIS people and the movement of them into Africa from South Africa. So it is really a worrying situation, and I don't think our law enforcement agencies are on top of this at this point of time. I've also heard that the embassies, the South African embassy and the US embassy also had communication, and South African embassy, I've heard, I'm not sure if it's true, did not respond in terms of the investigation of these 2 people. So what they do to collect funding is to have huge robberies, like the cash and transit processes, as well as kidnappings to collect funding for their operations elsewhere in Africa. And it could also be in South Africa that we can have some terrorism activities happening if we don't take control of the situation.
Worrying indeed, Prof. Thank you so much, though, for your time. Really do appreciate it. Professor Daniel Meyer there from the School of Public Management at the University of Johannesburg.